You learned to read the room before you learned to read books. You became fluent in emotional weather patterns, in the micro-expressions that told you whether tonight would be safe or whether you needed to become very, very small. You learned to decode size, to measure the weight of footsteps on stairs, to predict storms from the slightest shift in atmospheric pressure. And somewhere in that process, you stopped being a child. Psychologists call it parentification. It is what happens when the developmental current reverses, when the child becomes the emotional parent and the parent becomes the one who needs caretaking. The roles invert and the architecture of attachment warps in ways that echo for decades. And it does not always look like what you think. You might picture neglect or obvious abuse, but parentification often wears the mask of closeness. The single mother who calls her daughter her best friend. The father who confides his marriage problems to his son. It feels like trust, like being chosen, like you are mature beyond your years. It feels like being special. That is exactly what makes it so damaging. Because here is what most people miss. The harm is not just in what you had to do. The harm is in what you never got to be. Childhood is not just a time period you pass through. It is a developmental task with specific psychological milestones, and when you skip it, you carry the deficit forever. You cannot go back and retrieve it later. The parentified child learns a particular skill set that looks impressive but costs everything. You learn to manage other people's emotional states as a survival mechanism. You learned that your value was conditional on your usefulness, that love was something you earned through performance. You learned to detect need before it was spoken and to meet it before you were asked, because hesitation meant consequences. And you learned something even more insidious. You learned that your own needs were not just secondary, they were dangerous. Because every time you asked for something, every time you were just a kid who wanted comfort or attention or help, you felt the weight of disappointing someone who could not afford to be disappointed. So you learned to stop asking. So you became good, eerily good. Adults praised you for being mature for your age, responsible, such an old soul. Teachers loved you. Other parents wished their kids were more like you. And you learned to wear that praise like armor, never realizing it was also a cage. The compliments felt like evidence that you were doing it right, that your self-erasure was noble. Now you are an adult, and people wonder why you cannot relax, why you treat rest like a moral failure, like something weak people do, why you compulsively scan every room for problems you might solve, needs you might meet, emotional labor you might perform before anyone asks. You are exhausting to watch, and you know it, but you cannot stop. This is not anxiety. Or rather, it is not just anxiety. This is a nervous system that was trained in childhood to equate safety with usefulness, to interpret stillness as danger. You are not broken. You are not defective. You are running software written when you were 7, and it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Keep you valuable enough to keep. The research is unambiguous. A landmark study by Hooper and colleagues found that parentified children show significantly elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and chronic guilt well into adulthood. But the mechanism is what matters. The harm is not just emotional, it is neurological, encoded in the very wiring of how you process safety and connection. Parentification disrupts what developmental psychologists call the secure base. In healthy attachment, the child explores the world, knowing they can return to a caregiver for comfort and regulation when things get overwhelming. You never had that base. You were the base. You were the one providing regulation while your own system was still forming. So you learned to self-soothe in ways that look like strength but feel like loneliness. You learned to be your own parent, which sounds empowering in self-help books, until you realize it means you never get to be the child. Not then. Not now. Not ever, unless you do the brutal work of unlearning, and that work feels like regression, like weakness, like everything you were taught to avoid. And here is where it gets darker. You probably chose relationships and careers that replicate the original dynamic. Not because you are self-destructive, but because that is what feels like love to you. You are attracted to people who need you, to jobs that demand everything, because being needed is the only form of connection your nervous system recognizes as real. Reciprocity feels foreign. Mutual care feels like a trap. The technical term is repetition compulsion, first described by Freud, but refined by modern attachment research. We do not repeat our trauma because we want to. We repeat it because we are trying to master it, trying to rewrite the ending, trying to finally get it right. But you cannot rewrite the past by recreating it in the present. You only deepen the groove. You have probably noticed you cannot accept help without feeling weak. That when someone offers to care for you, your first instinct is suspicion or shame, or the immediate calculation of how you will repay the debt. Because in your original training, needing care meant being a burden. It meant taking resources from someone who was already drowning. It meant you were the problem. So you perform independence like it is a religion. You say you are fine when you are falling apart. You say you do not need anything when you are barely holding on. When you have not slept in days, when you are running on fumes and spite. And you feel virtuous about it, because the parentified child learns that self-sacrifice is the highest form of love. That needing nothing makes you noble. But here is the part almost no one talks about. Beneath the hyper-competence and the compulsive caretaking, there is rage. Appropriate, justified, bone-deep rage at having your childhood stolen, at being forced into a role you never auditioned for. And you have probably never let yourself feel it because anger was not safe then, and it still does not feel safe now. Because the parentified child cannot afford anger. Anger is a luxury of the protected. You learn to transmute rage into performance, into perfectionism, into the relentless drive to earn a safety that should have been your birthright. You learn to turn it inward, where it became depression, anxiety, a body that keeps the score even when your mind tries to forget. And when you do let anger surface, it comes out sideways. Passive aggression, sudden withdrawal. The quiet punishment of becoming unavailable to people who have come to depend on your endless availability. You have learned to weaponize the very thing you were praised for. You disappear, and the absence cuts deeper than any confrontation. The research by Stein and colleagues found that adults with childhood parentification history struggle profoundly with what is called differentiation. You cannot tell where you end and other people begin. Their emotions feel like your responsibility. Their problems feel like your failures. When someone you love is in pain, you feel it as if it is happening to you, and you believe you are obligated to fix it. This is why you feel guilty for things that are not your fault. Why you apologize for existing, for taking up space, for having needs. Why you cannot celebrate your own success without immediately thinking about who you might have disappointed or left behind. Your identity was built on being responsible for other people's well-being. Without that responsibility, who even are you? So when you finally set a boundary, when you finally say no, your nervous system interprets it as abandonment. Not their abandonment of themselves, your abandonment of them. The guilt is not irrational. It is the predictable output of a system designed in childhood. Every boundary feels like betrayal, and your body responds accordingly, flooding you with cortisol and shame. And here is the turn. The thing you have been running from your whole life. The parentified child grows into an adult who cannot rest because rest means someone else might be suffering without you. And if they suffer without you, if they manage without your intervention, what was it all for? What were you for? The entire architecture of your identity collapses. Your entire identity is scaffolded on being necessary, which means the most terrifying thing imaginable is not being needed. It means the dissolution of self. This is why you cannot stop. Stopping feels like death. It feels like ceasing to exist. So you keep moving, keep performing, keep earning the love that should have been unconditional from the beginning. But the brutal truth is this. You were never responsible for your parents' emotional survival. You were a child. You did the best you could with a developmental task you should never have been given. And every day you continue the pattern, you are choosing their needs over your own recovery. You are re-traumatizing yourself to avoid the grief of admitting it should never have been your job. Recovery is not about blame. It is not about vilifying the parent who parentified you, who was likely parentified themselves in an unbroken chain going back generations. It is about reclaiming the developmental stages you skipped. It is about learning, for the first time, what it feels like to be cared for without having to earn it. To be loved not for what you do, but for what you are. And it is about grieving the childhood you did not get. Grieving the parent you needed but never had. The one who could have held your fear instead of handing you theirs. grieving the version of yourself that could have existed if you had been allowed to just be small and scared and imperfect. That grief is not optional. It is the price of admission to a different life. The way forward is not more competence. You have competence. You have so much competence it is suffocating you. The way forward is letting yourself be incompetent, letting yourself need, letting yourself take up space without justifying it with productivity. It will feel like falling. That is how you know it is working. Healing feels like losing control because control was the original wound. You were not born to be useful. You were born to be whole, to be seen, to be delighted in, for no reason other than you exist. And the child inside you who learned to scan for danger and manage adult emotions and swallow their own needs, that child is still waiting for someone to say, you do not have to do anything to deserve love. You can be that someone. So the question you opened with, why you learned to read the room before you learned to read books, the answer is survival. But survival mode was never meant to be permanent. You are allowed to stop surviving and start living. You always were.